Todd Lefko. Hello, I'm Todd Lefko, and I'm chairman of the East-West Connections, and I'd like to thank our partners for tonight. The Russian Museum of Art in Minneapolis, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Affairs, McAllister Russian Studies Department, and Zerkalo, the Russian media. Pirhan called me yesterday and said he was possibly going to have to be in New York today. Well, last night at 9:30, I discovered that he was going to New York, and he's on a plane at the moment. He's one of the best business minds I know, and tried every travel combination to be with us and has sent some suggestions that I'll mention later. He's been a major contributor to programs in the past and will be again in the future. Fortunately, we are honored to have two of the top economists as our presenters. I will be moderator and taking Pier's role and make a few comments following the comments of Sergey and Raymond. I'll make my comments based on working and living in Moscow for 35 years, our monthly shipments to and from Russia and quarterly shipments to Kiev, which have been paused, my about 700 published articles on economics, history, and social trends, our current growing business in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and my happy participation in the Innovation Advisory Board for Almaty Management University in Kazakhstan. I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sergey Alexsashenko. Sergey has been the former deputy chair of the Russian Central Bank, the deputy finance minister of Russia, and chairman and CEO of Merrill Lynch, Russia. Sergey, пожалуйста, please, your comments.
Todd, thank you very much for inviting me for this event, and thank you all sponsors or organizers for this opportunity. As I understand, we are going to discuss the situation in the Russian economy. And today, Rosstat, Russian Statistical Agency, published its first assessment of the first quarter result that for many people could be very strange. The Russian Statistical Agency said that compared to the first quarter of the previous year, so the quarter of first quarter, January, February, March of 2022, the decline was only 1.8%. So very, very modest. And of course, it's not a collapse of the Russian economy, and Russian economy is not a tatters. And of course, these demonstrate, as President Putin says, that Russian economy is very strong. It could resist, it could survive, it is very efficient, blah, 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 so on. But as usually when we say, first, no one economist has one hand. So we say on the one hand or the other hand. The second, there is a lie, big lie, and statistics. And to understand what's really going on in Russian economy, I will try to give some details that will help you. First of all, in minus 1.8% to the first quarter of 2022, it's really a very small number, because after the massive Western sanctions, many economists believe that Russian economy will decline something like 8, 10, or even 12%. That became very unrealistic. And the biggest reason for that is that experts did not make a real fair judgment of the position of the Russian economy in the global world. The Russian economy is one of the major supply of natural resources to the global world, and that is the basis of its merchandise export. And if you look on the structure of the Russian export, you will see that oil, gas, metals, wood and pulp, fertilizers, gold, grain, and that is independent on price, could be from 80 to 85% of Russian export. So global economy after the COVID crisis is in the growing phase. And of course, Russia being a major supplier, or the biggest supplier of oil, the biggest supplier of palladium, major supply. Okay, Russian economy is within top 5 suppliers of 20 different types of natural resources in the global economy. So a global economy cannot survive, cannot grow, cannot continue going on without Russian natural resources. And that's why if we look attentively what really was banned for export from Russia, we can see ferrous metals, and we can see wood and wood processed products. So that are two major sectors that were touched by sanctions, and In wood industry, the decline is about 40%. So that is the industry that suffered most of the sanctions. In the middle of the previous year, the fall in ferrous metals was about 10%. But after that, the massive military expenditures of the Russian budget increased the demand for steel. So all in all, the decline in steel production in the ferrous metals is less than 6%. So all other industries were not affected by Western sanctions. One of the sectors that should be mentioned is gas production that declined in Russia by 15%, and within Gazprom, the major Russian company, gas production declined by 20%, but it was not because of sanctions, it was by the very sophisticated political decision of Vladimir Putin, who made his judgment in mid-2021, just 7-8 months before the invasion of Ukraine, that his political target is to freeze Europe and to cause political tensions, social tensions in Europe and split Europe into parts. So since mid-21, Russia, Gazprom started to cut its supply of gas, and finally, by the end of 2022, the export of Russian gas to Europe declined by more than 3/4. But once again, it was not the result of sanctions. It was voluntary decision of President Putin. Luckily for Europe, the winter was mild and the consumption of gas was much less than usual. And Europe did not go freezing, and Europe did not collapse, and Europe continued to support Ukraine. So another very important factor that was causing problems in the Russian economy, it was, I would say, it's moral sanctions. It's the decision of many international companies to leave Russia. And the most significant effect was in car production, because Russian car industry was 80% based on foreign companies, on international brands, and all of them left Russia, and that caused the fall in the car production by 70%. But once again, it was not the result of sanctions. And being honest, the share of the car industry, car production, that is not strongly localized, is not great in Russian GDP. So all other sectors were not touched by sanctions. Even oil sanctions, they were targeted on oil revenues, but not on the volumes of oil. And that means that oil production in physical terms increased, oil export in physical terms increased. That means the pipelines produced more value added. The railway transportation produced more value added. Shipping produced more value added. So the economy did not suffer significantly in the short run from the sanctions. And starting from the mid of the last year, President Putin increased significantly military expenditures, mostly say expenditures on procurement of weapons, and all in all, the increase in expenditures on defense-related issues was more than 2% of GDP in the second half of the previous year. And of course, as many economists could understand, that additional budgetary expenditures from the fiscal reserves, they caused the boost in GDP, in the growth of the economy. So the structure of this growth is very strange. Of course, military expenditures, they do not produce potential for the future growth, but for statistics, it doesn't matter. If you measure day-to-day statistics, if you measure what happened in the last quarter of the previous year and the first quarter of this year, it doesn't matter very much what do you produce, butter or cannons. So Russian economy produces cannons, but the statistics say everything is fine and President Putin is happy. But saying all that, maybe that are all good news. And if we compare the current level of the Russian economy, let's say to the beginning of 2013, that is 10 years ago, in 10 years, the growth of the Russian economy was less than 7%. So that is, I would say, the major indicator of the situation in Russian economy, that after President Putin came back to Kremlin for his, I don't know, third term in 2012, the Russian economy stopped to grow. And 7% in 10 years, it's very, very, very mild growth. And I believe that that is the major indication of what's going on and what is the real situation. Even if we compare the very last, let's say, 5-6 years, the growth is not significantly high. It's about 1% per annum. And once again, it's the situation in the Russian economy. Maybe the very last point I would like to mention that surprised me a lot, and that is one of the, let's say, miracle of sanctions against Russia, is that when in February of last year, after the Russian invasion, assets of the Central Bank of Russia were frozen and accounts of the Central Bank of Russia were frozen, and nothing happened. Because many economists before that, including myself, we call this option as a nuclear, and we believe that it may cause significant troubles in Russian financial markets, significant devaluation of the ruble, in high inflation. But that did really happened, and the period between initial invasion, beginning of the invasion, February 24th, and let's say March 10, so 20 days, inflation jumped up to 10% per month, and the ruble devalued by 70%. But after that, central bank imposed very strict capital control and even banned some current transactions, in fact, making ruble non-convertible currency. And the central bank did not sold its foreign exchange reserves, did not sold hard currency, dollars or euros, in the exchange markets, but central bank is able to limit the demand for foreign exchange. And that in fact was in the short run, it was a very efficient decision, because it helped to stabilize the exchange rate, and even more by mid 2022, ruble revalued by 30% compared to the days before the invasion. Ruble was very, very strong in the middle of last year, but afterwards it started to devalue once again, and today it is approximately I would say 15% weaker than before the invasion. So, but that policy being very, very efficient, making ruble non-convertible in the short run, of course, it is a policy of kicking the can down the road, because central bank is moving all problems, all financial problems, all demand for foreign exchange to the future years, and sooner or later Russian ruble will suffer from that. But I would say that, finalizing my initial remarks, Russian economy suffered significantly from sanctions, from the war. In 2021 and the beginning of 2022, the growth of the Russian economy was about 4.5% per year, the average growth rate. And even if we trust Rosstat, and even we do not reconsider military expenditures, -2% in the previous year, so the gap is 6.5%. Russian economy lost 6.5% of its economic dynamics because of the war. That is the comprehensive, that is the most general figure that allows us to understand the price of the war. So I will stop here, Todd.
Thank you, Sergey. That's very interesting. I'm honored also to introduce Dr. Raymond Robertson, who's director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy at Texas A&M, and the Roy Rue Chair in Economics and Government. On a personal note, years ago, when I ran the program for the brightest high schoolers in Minnesota, Raymond was my student. Later, when I was an NGO delegate at the United Nations, I walked one day into the bookstore at the UN in New York, and one of Raymond's books was the featured book at the United Nations for that month. So it is my pleasure to introduce a good friend and wonderful economist, Raymond Robertson.
Thank you very much, Todd, for that extremely generous, as always, introduction. And I will say it's very difficult for me to be following Sergey Alexsashenko, right, who did such a wonderful, brilliant job covering the basics of the Russian economy. And you have a lot of great friends, Todd. I'll say that. I've never seen any of your friends not be spectacular. So you have excellent taste in friends. I'll say that. But speaking specifically now back to the Russian economy, first of all, the first thing I'd like to say is, of course, I agree with everything that Sergey had said, and I thought he did a great job summarizing. There are a couple of additional points I would like to make, and perhaps even offer a little bit more color on the commentary. One of the things that is absolutely surprising about the last year, I think, and not just from the point of view of us here on the panel, but also globally, was that the overall negative predictions for both the Russian economy, the Ukraine economy, and the global economy did not seem to come to fruition. And that actually presents a very interesting puzzle. So I would actually like to focus a little bit on some of that puzzle and draw upon some of the statistics that Sergey had just presented. One of the key points I would like to add on to the previous remarks is the importance of anticipation. So I think it's very clear that Vladimir Putin anticipated a lot of the actions of the West following the invasion. I think he anticipated the sanctions. I think he anticipated the potential macroeconomic effects of the sanctions. And the second point I would like to add to that is that a less appreciated fact of economics over the last 50 years and maybe even 70 years was that countries of the world are now increasingly savvy in understanding how macroeconomics works. And it doesn't matter necessarily if you're in a communist country or a pseudo-communist country or capitalist country, understanding the basics of, I would say, Keynesian economics really becomes incredibly useful in managing macroeconomic shocks. So in that context, one of the things that countries have learned all around the world is that when you are facing a negative economic shock, you want to counteract that through a stimulus package, whether it's monetary policy or fiscal policy. And as Sergey pointed out, the Russian government was able to counteract the anticipated negative impact of sanctions and cutting off of trade with a very proactive, positive macroeconomic shock, a stimulus, if you would, by increasing government spending that was part of spending on the war, but also in other areas. We see that this is a classic Keynesian economic move because they increased borrowing in order to do that. So we see an increase in the Russian deficit, which eventually is going to have to be covered either by printing more money or by borrowing more money. And given the fact that the global financial markets are becoming increasingly tight and less accessible, we just saw with the Eastern European Economic Forum, not a lot of people showed up. There's a lot, it was pretty sparsely attended, is that the access to the global financial markets are actually going to put a lot of pressure on Russia. And moving forward, if they want to continue that stimulus, they're going to have to turn to either some other markets, such as China, to borrow the money, or they're going to have to start printing money. And as Sergey pointed out, that they were able to manage the inflationary pressures through monetary policy, right? They're able to constrict that monetary policy to keep inflation somewhat under control, but it's not clear how sustainable that's going to be. So what we've seen actually is an example of an anticipation of a negative economic shock and having the tools, the macroeconomic tools, to counteract it in, I would say, somewhat of an effective way. Now, I would say that if you look at the first point, which is specifically the Russian economy, that explains, I think, and I'd love to hear Sergey's guess or kind of feedback or response to that, how much that actually affected the saving Russia from these negative economic shocks. But there were a number of other factors that that really surprised global experts. I mean, this wasn't the only surprise that we had, that the Russian economy didn't do as badly as we expected, or that the Ukrainian economy. If we look at global commodity markets, they also seem to recover much quicker than we thought. If you look at crude oil, for example, the prices of crude oil spiked obviously after the invasion, but they spiked in June 2022 and have been falling steadily since then, and maybe a little bit of bumps. Sergey had mentioned palladium. Palladium actually had peaked in terms of commodity prices in February 22, even before the invasion. And those prices have been basically stable or leveling off since then. If you look at soybeans, they peaked in June of 2022. They rose in March 2023, but they've been falling for the rest of this year. If you look at rice futures, they've basically been rising consistently and didn't really seem to respond. And the other critical ones, obviously, as Sergey mentioned, are natural gas, which rose dramatically in March 2022, and there was a lot of panic about the heating and whatnot. But those prices peaked in August of 2022 and started exhibiting a very sharp decline since then, and now they're down to $255 per MMBTUs. Wheat was another one, right? We were really, really concerned about wheat right after the invasion because prices were expected to spike, and that was expected to have very negative effects on developing countries like Egypt. Those wheat prices actually peaked around, May, about the middle of May in 2022, and have been coming down since then. So one of the lessons that I think we should take away from this is that these really dramatic negative expectations about global commodity markets and how that was going to affect the world might have been not taking into account the responsiveness and the resilience of, and I'm going to say this, Todd, but of global capitalism. You know what I'm saying? That that global capitalist markets, now that we have a very globally integrated world, markets around the world were able to absorb those shocks. They were able to respond. They were able to fill in the lack of supply that was coming out of Russia and Ukraine and mitigate those price increases. Now, I will say that that doesn't mean that developing countries necessarily are out of the woods. I mean, what we've seen in Egypt currently is spiking inflation. It's not just food. It has to do with a lot of other factors. We still see famine in Ethiopia, but again, these are not being directly linked by many experts to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, right? The conflict in Ethiopia, for example, has been going on since 2020, and obviously the spike in prices and grain markets didn't help, but that really is not being listed now by experts as a main cause. They also are dealing with fighting and civil war and those types of things. Egypt, right, is also, they're experiencing rising prices of lots of things, but most experts are thinking that that's really more tied to management of the currency, right? So that the Egyptian currency has been depreciating rapidly, and that's been increasing the price of imports. So overall, right, I think what's really surprising, and I think it's something that we might want to discuss, especially with Sergey here, is such an amazingly accomplished economist, is how were those global markets so resilient, and how were we so wrong about these predictions? And what does that mean going forward? So I think going forward, I'm not saying at all that developing countries are out of the woods, that they're safe, or that the Russian economy is on a path to recovery. I think in the long run, I completely agree with Sergey that the prospects in the long run are especially grim because Keynesian macroeconomic shocks are short run, they're not long run, and they put long run economic growth at risk. And that's exactly what Putin is doing to the Russian economy, putting long run growth at risk. But nevertheless, in this medium term, a year or so, a year and a half after, it is interesting how markets have been so resilient. So I'd like to leave you with those comments and open it up hopefully for discussion. And thank you all again for being here tonight. And thanks, Todd, for the invitation.
Raymond, thank you very much. I want to start with some notes that Pyrrhus sent me. He said a couple of points to consider if there's an opportunity. You might want to consider adding the tragedy in Ukraine will continue to exert a significant economic anchor that will weigh heavily on the global economy for at least the next 3+ years. Expected continued volatility in energy and commodity prices to come, soaring costs of food and increased food scarcity, especially in the developing world, diminishing and uneven access to public health in a less balanced world. Irrespective of Kremlin leadership, there's really no realistic circumstance where Russia returns to full trading partner status on the world stage in the near to medium stage. Rebuilding of Ukraine will take both time and be costly. The role of China and India, which we haven't discussed yet, both of whom are benefiting from a diminished Russia and an ability to supply, will continue to rise. Geopolitics will define the medium to long-range investment climate going forward. Business and politics will remain intertwined. In 1986, the American historian Melvin Kranzberg noted, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. That technology is reflected in culture and values. The same is true of economics. We've built smart cities, smart bombs, and smart systems, but not always smart decision makers. In Russia, the government has sought to control reaction to negative economics through control of information and subsidies. These are not possible eternally. Putin supposedly was running 82% in the latest, I don't think it's Levada, but one of the other polls. But the truth is, if you answer negatively, there's a chance you can go to jail for 15 years. So that's a wonderful way to have a high poll rating, which is when you see polls in Russia, take them with a grain of salt. There are no good polls in Russia. There's growing inequality in Russia, but there's few channels to complain except for the movement out of the country, with anywhere from 1.3 to 2 million. And I've seen a number of numbers, Sergey, and I'm not sure, but 2 million is the top figure, but I think it's higher than that. The other thing to be considered here is the role of time, in economics and history. Putin is gambling on the long run, on the long-term struggle, and the West becoming tired, the concept of a Ukraine fatigue. So what happens is that we push toward the idea of short-term thinking and results. The longer the war extends, the greater danger of people becoming tired of supporting Ukraine, which is why you're seeing support for some political candidates in the United States by the Russians, as opposed to others. We're worried about the idea that Putin has basically removed Russian public attitudes at this moment as a part of the decisional relationship. The West has not. Here, politics still matter. You get the idea of the Overton window. And the Overton window is the idea where the issues have to face the concept of attention and importance before a governmental action will take place. I've often kidded that my argument with the founders of the Constitution is that they didn't spend more time on internet security. There's no way that could have happened, because at a certain point, we ignored this in 1999 when bombs were falling in Grozny. We ignored it in 2008 in Georgia. We ignored it in 2014 with Crimea. And now we're paying attention. At the moment, you start to get the question of the Collingridge dilemma, where in effect, when an issue is easy to and relatively cheap to resolve, people don't pay attention. When it's expensive, when people notice it, it's expensive and difficult politically to change. That's what we're into, at the moment with Ukraine at this moment. The point I've arrived at is that no one is going to be the winner. Is that in some ways, this is going to be where we like to think in Manichaean terms, where there's the idea of good and evil and the idea of winners and losers. I don't think it's going to happen here. I think if any victory is going to be Pyrrhic, that Ukraine will need to be rebuilt at a cost of minimally probably 1 trillion and probably more. And the issue is whether the West and the US are willing to put up the money. I think you're going to see a conference that will pledge great amount of money, and how much people actually come through with, I think, is going to be questionable at that point. Much depends on the next month and Ukrainian progress or losses or stalemate in terms of timing and the form of settlement, which is possible at that point. The other thing I want to bring up is the idea of the role of individual, which is one of the basic questions in history. This is Putin's war. This is Putin's mistake. And the issue is that he made a mistake based upon past economic and political consequences, and he misjudged the past, which has changed the future. The war has now become existential in some ways for Putin's survival in Ukraine, but it's a different kind of survival. It's the loss of one person's position, as opposed to if Ukraine loses the war, basically Ukraine does not exist. And that's one of the reasons that the Ukrainians are fighting so difficultly. For Russia, they could declare victory with segments that they maintain. And no matter what's going to happen, you're going to watch Putin declare victory, no matter what happens here, I think. The loss of Putin through either health or Siloviki plus the elite replacing him is a possibility. But the replacement possibilities are in some cases as bad or worse than Putin. If you get a Prigozhin or some of the other people that are there. The issue becomes now short-term versus long-term. The shift from oil and gas, the loss of a generation of thinkers and scientists, the long-term image as thugs, the loss of potential of democracy and encouragement of innovation. It was the idea of what Skoltech could have been and never will be. It'll be years before business returns, including our business, which has basically been paused. We start watching the loss of strength compared with China. I believe that Moscow will be a suburb of Beijing by the time this is all over. And I don't think the Russians understand that. You're seeing a sense of focus upon themselves. The one thing that I've noticed, and this is my observation, not others, is that the Russians have a very different mentality. My friends don't mind if you're angry with them in Russia. To ignore them is the worst thing that a Russian can feel, if that they're not important. And so they're fighting for a sense of what they feel is nobody appreciates them or understands the importance that they are. You're watching a change in the Russian position because of the growth of the global South. And I think that that's all those are factors. For Ukraine, it's a potential of a loss of land. The question of how many people will return after the war, and whether basically there'll be enough people that will choose when they build new lives to go back, whether enough of their infrastructure will be rebuilt, the economic promises and whether they'll be done, the threats to Zelensky, if people see him selling out because the agreements don't provide enough of a benefit to a perceived benefit at that point, the role of corruption. To have a good economy, you basically have to control corruption, and the Ukrainians are trying to do this, but not with perfection at this moment, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people are not going to give money right there. He'll either be a hero for history or he'll be probably removed. The other question that's here is, what does the Russian economy mean for the US and the world? The impact of Russian actions relative to Taiwan if they wipe out TSMC as a provider of advanced microchips, a possible war with China if they believe that the United States is weak, the disruption of supply chains, which we haven't mentioned yet, but we're seeing a reordering of supply chains across the world, the increased pressure on the environment, and the fight over rare earths and access to needs. The other thing that we haven't mentioned is the idea that there's a true fight which the Russian actions have exacerbated, and that's the fight over the role of information and what becomes true in the world anymore, and the concept of truth worldwide, and the potential role and impact of AI. That's coming in here. The broader issue remains, how do you deal with leaders and societies that do not follow international standards and rules, but simply power as a determinant? What I'd like to do, now is that Sergey made some brilliant comments, as did Raymond. And I want to throw the first question out to both of you. Is the idea about, do sanctions are the method we've chosen because we don't want to go to war physically in terms of bombs. Do sanctions work, and how would they become more effective if the United States and the West had used them better? Sergey or Raymond, either one.
Okay, Raymond, let you start.
Sure. So at the Bush School of Government and Public Service, we focus a lot on defense and national security and international security. We talk a lot about sanctions, and one of my students actually was just doing a paper on this, summarizing the academic literature. And the academic literature basically comes to two conclusions. And the first one is that sanctions are actually very effective at reducing trade, especially when they're targeted at trade. So they can keep Todd out of Russia. Now, the second point, though, that comes out of the sanctions literature is that they're actually very ineffective at achieving their stated goals, which is to try and get regime change or alter the behaviors. Because a lot of times countries that are the targets of sanctions just tend to dig in. They tend to dig in a lot harder. And especially in the Russian case, there was a lot of anticipation for the sanctions. So the sanctions themselves, right, might have had the effect that we expected on trade, but to the extent that they were anticipated, and obviously they had no real effect. Russia didn't end the war. I mean, that was kind of the goal. I mean, they didn't realize that the war was too costly, and so they pulled back. I mean, we haven't seen any evidence that the sanctions have achieved their fundamental goal, which is trying to contain Russia. So, I think they're effective at the means, but not so effective at the ends.
Yeah, I have to agree with Raymond completely. I can sign any of his words. But to add, I would say that If sanctions could reach intended targets, there would not be such regimes like in North Korea, in Venezuela, and in Iran. Yeah, and we see that the sanctions pressure on all of three of those countries is much more significant because the size of the economy, because of the role of those economy in the global world. And nevertheless, political regimes survive, and there are virtually no successes in changing their policy. And I would like to come back to the previous Raymond statement, his very interesting topics of anticipations, of predictions, of perception that is reality. And when he rightly mentioned that oil price spiked from, let's say, $95 before the invasion up to somewhere $115 or even $120, and all other commodities spiked at the same, approximately the same time and the same magnitude, I would make a step back. Because in fact, the significant rise in oil price and commodity prices was from the beginning of 21 until the beginning of 22. That was the post-COVID effect. Oil price in January in 21 was about $65 per barrel. Yeah. And before the invasion, it was $95 per barrel. So that's 50% rise in oil price. And that caused the gasoline price increase in the United States and Europe. And still many Europeans believe that it is a result of the war. So because of that, they believe that if the price for gasoline increased significantly after the war, that is the result of the war. And when the war started, there were many anticipation that Western sanctions will cut supply of Russian natural resources, mostly of oil, to the international markets. If we remember, somewhere in mid-March, United States, Canada, and UK announced that they ban import of Russian oil. And Europe started to discuss ban on Russian oil as well. And many experts believed, and market participants believed, that it will be physical constraint of supply of Russian oil to the global market. Yeah. Europe, as we know, is not very fast in decision-making, European Union, and it took them 3 months until somewhere mid-June to agree upon oil sanctions. And until then, oil price was going up. And somewhere in mid-May, and in May, there was a consensus reached that Europe will not impose ban on import of Russian oil before beginning of December. And market said, wow, lucky we, the supply of Russian oil will continue. And that's why oil price started to decline very fast. And the same happened with wheat. Ukraine is one of the biggest suppliers of wheat and of agricultural product of sunflower oil to the global markets. And the Black Sea ports is the hub for the Ukrainian export. And it was closed by Russia. And in the end of May last year, Turkey and African countries, they pushed Putin to open the ports for the export of Ukrainian agricultural products. And after that, the pressure, the anticipation, that perception that there will be a shortage of food for agricultural products in the global market diminished and evaporated finally. So that's a really very important point, and that's really one more time to emphasize the role of anticipations, the role of perception in the global markets.
You know, one of the functions of economics is to look at the past and analyze the present to determine what the future trends or patterns are going to be. If you were saying now what you think the economy will be like in Russia in 5 years and 10 years, what would you suggest based upon current knowledge?
I would say that nothing terrible will happen with Russian economy. Russian economy will continue to produce natural resources. If the global economy will continue to grow, so that means that there will be demand. And the main, I would say that, I don't know, will it happen this year, next year? What will, how long the war will continue? When military expenditures will start to shrink in Russia? But well, let's imagine that within short run, within I don't know 2 years, the Russian economy will hit the bottom, and after that it will start to grow. The growth of the Russian economy will not be very strong. If the global economy will grow 3.5%, Russian economy will grow somewhere between 2.5%. That is not so bad for the United States, for the European Union. Nevertheless, if we compare with emerging markets, of course, it's not very impressive numbers. But saying that overall statistical numbers may be not so terrible, the major change in the Russian economy will be decline of the technological quality. So, for example, in 2012 or 2013, Russian car market was going to overtook Germany by size of the cars, and it was very close to 3 million cars sold per year. After the Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, Russian market shrink to somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million cars per year. Last year, it was less than 500,000 cars per year. And this year, we see that the share of Chinese cars of no-name brands, so is in Russia somewhere between 30 and 35%. So the Chinese car producers that are ranked number 50, number 70 in their own markets, they're dominating, they're producing, selling some cars in Russia. So of course, and it's not very sophisticated cars. Of course, it's bad. It's a car. It can move. But if you compare the quality, you recognize that it's not modern American or European or Japanese or South Korean car. But nevertheless, that is technological degradation. Russia is banned. Russia has no access to, let's say, 5G telecom equipment. So yes, Russia today has sufficient fourth generation, and maybe it will be able to find supplies of the fourth generation equipment in the years to come. But Russia will never receive 5G. Russia will never receive 6G if it appears. So that does it destroy your life? Well, of course not. You can survive with 4G, and it may provide you a lot of opportunities. All of us, we lived with 4G, and it was okay. But we understand that without 4G, there could not be self-driving cars. Yeah, and that is technological gap. So Russia has a ban to access to the most advanced chips. And if a year ago, two Russian companies, Sberbank and Yandex, were somewhere among the leaders in artificial intelligence, let's say within top 20 maybe companies in the world, okay, today both CEOs of both companies declared that, okay, we have constraints. We have no access to chips. We have no access to NVIDIA cards. So that stops us in our development. Today, the gap is not so strong. Okay, we foresee another 5 years. We understand that 5 years from now, Russian artificial intelligence will be lagging well behind. So once again, it's not an economic collapse like in Venezuela, because I believe that at least as of now, the economic team of Putin is very pro-market, so they are strongly opposing any ideas of freezing prices, of state control of industrial production, of managing supply and demand. So if prices are free in Russian economy, yes, it will be slow growth with a technological degradation.
Before I call on Raymond on this, if people have questions from the audience, put them in the chat function. And we'll be turning toward questions in a few minutes from the audience. Raymond, any comments on this?
Well, yeah, I was going to refer to one of the questions in the chat that said, isn't the perceived, resilience in the Russian economy evidence of a continuing lack of understanding of our understanding of Russia, right? And I think that that's why it's important to keep having Russian studies like at Macalester College and other places. It's really critical that we continue to focus on Russia and try to understand it. And I think that's really critical. Having said that, I've been teaching economic growth and development, for many years. And my students actually find it somewhat amusing now that I'm so predictable that I explain that economic growth actually comes down to just three things, right? It's technology and endowments are labor and capital. So if you want to think about economic growth in Russia, no matter where it is, and I would say, regardless of the economy, we have to look at technology, which Sergey did a brilliant job of mentioning, right? The limits on technology are going to be limiting growth. We also see a limit in capital. I think that I already mentioned this lack of access to global capital markets and just machinery is going to play a role. But the other thing that we have not mentioned is just the lack of human power, right? So the lack of sort of this generations of very of people that they need to keep the economy going. They've lost too many in the war already, and they've also had a relatively low birth rate, right? And that has been contributing, I think, to diminished expectations of longer run growth. So, I mean, I might even be, I wouldn't want to try to put a number on it. And I'm going to obviously just go with Sergey's number, right? I mean, it's as good as probably the best one, definitely on the panel today. And so I'm going to go along with that. But having said that, I think I'm pretty, pessimistic based on those three things. I mean, capital, labor, and technology. Any of those don't seem to be shining stars for the Russian economy in the near or the long term.
One of the implications that's here is on the growth of inequality, not just in Russia, but in Western Europe and across the United States and across the world. And there are a lot of intellectual discussions now on what's the future of capitalism, as opposed to the planned economy, and where the line comes, I'm not sure, because it's sort of a fuzzy area. Does capitalism have a future, and in which form? Because there are those who think with some of the recent American legislation, we're moving more toward a planned economy, than others. What do you think in terms of capitalism?
May I go ahead?
Yeah, sure, please go on.
Please.
So I will say this is just my perspective as a free market economist. So you have to take, that I carry a card as an economist that I have to say certain things. And I don't think that there's really a debate between socialism and capitalism as an economic organizational paradigm. I mean, there really isn't. I mean, I think we've tried lots of other things, and capitalism is absolutely the worst thing we've done, except it's only better than everything else. And there's lots of problems with capitalism, but there's no way that we're going to not have capitalism going forward, because nothing else generates wealth the way that capitalism does. Now, I agree with you, Todd. I think, as always, your brilliant insights are key. And that is that it's not a question of capitalism versus socialism. That's not a debate anymore. I mean, capitalism already won. It's a question of how much do you want to sort of play with capitalism around the edges, right? And I think that we are moving towards an understanding that capitalism, I think of capitalism as like an automobile. An automobile is incredibly complex. There's brakes and steering and all kinds of things going on in the engine. You don't want your hands on everything. You don't want to grab the tires with your bare hands to try and stop it or try and steer it. All you need to do is do this. Capitalism needs to be steered just a little bit to make sure it stays on track. And the question is, how much steering do you really need to do? If you veer too much, you're going to crash, right? If you try and take too much control, you're going to fail completely. So I think we are moving towards a little bit of acknowledgement that we do need to address some inequalities. I think that's absolutely fundamentally clear. And I think that we are moving in that direction. But my opinion is, the capitalism is definitely here to stay. That's my opinion.
Sergey, any comments?
Very short comments. I would second Raymond. Brilliant explanation. And the only one phrase to add is that capitalism of 2023 is very different from the capitalism of 1973 and different of 1923. And that is different of 1873 and of 1823. So capitalism is changing. Capitalism is not a dogmatic state, very rigid, very sound, without change. Yes, it's political life, and inequality and many other impulses sent to politicians in different countries, they cause different effects. And capitalism changes. And this steering the wheel. In one country, it is stronger because of the narrow road or sharper turns. In other countries where you have six lines highway, you may sleep being drive by your Tesla and hoping that you will avoid crash. So yes, capitalism is changing and nothing better exists.
You know, Sergey, you just returned from Brussels and the meeting of a number of Russian leaders in exile to talk about the idea of what Russia would be like after Putin. Can you talk about that for a minute, you know, in terms of the discussions and some people have suggested it was a wonderful intellectual discussion, but, you know, the realism was not as based on current events as possible. And others feel that the discussion needs to happen now. You know, could you talk about that for a minute? Because I think that ties into both economics and societal and democratic relationships.
Todd, it's my pleasure to tell about Brussels meeting. And the first thing I have to mention, it was not the meeting of Russian opposition. A Russian opposition met 6 weeks before, in the end of April in Berlin. And the majority of players in Russian opposition, most of them live abroad, they agreed upon certain principles, let's say 3 principles. First, no, not to war, not to Putin, and we are looking for the return of Russia to the civilized world. That three basic points of the agreements of Russian opposition. And after that, a group of members of the European Parliament launched an initiative to have a discussion between members of European Parliament and, let's say, not consolidated by members of the Russian opposition who joined this Berlin Declaration. And I would say that was a dialogue about the future of Russian European, or mostly, let's say, more Russian European rather than Russia to West relations. And the leader of this group, Andrius Kubilius from Lithuania, he said in the beginning of this meeting that democracies do not run war one against another. And that's why there is only one way to have safe Europe to prevent any other war caused by Russia, is to move Russia to transform Russia into democratic society. And that was a discussion. I would not say that it was not we were not opponents, let's say, Russians and Europeans, and we're not debating, but we were looking on this situation, what should happen, what could happen in the future, how Europe and Russia can move towards one another, and what should happen, what next Russian leadership, because everybody agrees that Putin will not make Russia more democratic, more pro-European, more pro-Western, more pro-market, more pro-globalized. So, but the next Russian leaders, they will have chances, they will have opportunities to decide. And that's why the idea of initiators of members of the European Parliament was to prepare a platform how Europe may deal with the future generation of Russian politicians. So, and that's why the discussion was very interesting. And as was said at the very end, at the conclusion, the members of the European Parliament, they plan to initiate establishing a steering committee looking for the relations with Russia opposition and with future Russia. So that's the outcome. It was not about economy, it was about mostly political relations, political development, relations between Europe and Russia.
What, for both of you, what's the best policy of the United States at this moment? Because you've got a number of goals. You've got the idea of the war. You've got the idea of trying to rebuild a democratic society, the idea of relationships, the idea of how the United States fits into the future of the world. What's the best policy of the United States government at this moment to encourage those processes to come out as well as we hope for? And since, Raymond, this is one of the things you teach, of how to think about this. I'd like both of your comments on this because you're coming from different angles.
Well, I'd like to introduce a potentially radical idea in response to that. And that is, at the end of World War II, we were celebrating the victory over Germany, which had unleashed horrors across Europe. But the end of World War II made it obvious that there was a larger, deeper global conflict at play. And
Yeah.
Germany ultimately became a theater for the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. I would actually like to suggest that it's very possible that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is actually the theater for a larger conflict, which is between the United States and China. The reason why the United States is especially interested, or one reason why we're especially interested in Ukraine, is because of China's threat over Taiwan.
Yeah.
And we've already seen an increasing militarization in Japan. We've seen increasing tensions, and the fall of Ukraine, or the lack of our response to Ukraine being over or invaded by Russia, sends signals to China that it's okay to expand into the Pacific. And it's very important for that reason that the United States, among others, obviously for doing the right thing for Ukraine and standing up to a hostile Russia, it's also very important for the larger theater. So we really need to figure out how to maintain that balance, to try and push back against Russia in ways that send signals not only to the Russian government that we're not going to tolerate this kind of hostility, that the world will not tolerate this kind of unacceptable hostility, but we will also not tolerate other examples that might occur in the Pacific. So I think it's very important that we demonstrate our resolve, and we don't want to obviously get pushed into a nuclear confrontation, but maintaining very strong support for the Ukraine is not just important for the Ukraine, it's important globally.
Sergey, any thoughts?
I would be even more aggressive, if I may say. I believe that Russia will not change, will not become more peaceful, more democratic under Putin. And Putin is the strong dictator, consolidating all power in Russia. Of course, we may see some indications that he is losing control of this or of that. Nevertheless, he is number one, and there is no number two, number three, and number four. There are several number fives, and they are fighting for the position of number four. So there should not be misunderstanding. There is no any fight for the position number one in Russia. Nobody, no one of Russian politicians is looking to undermine Putin because he is keeping his hands on everything. And to change this situation, to move Russia towards a question, what is wrong and what is right, United States should supply much more weapons to Ukraine, because only military victory of Ukraine may cause political changes in Russia. Military victory of Ukraine will weaken Putin's position. It will demonstrate that he made a mistake, and it will be visible for everyone. His military defeat in Ukraine will demonstrate that his calculus was wrong, that he is overestimating his personal role of Russia, place of Russia in the global world, and so strengths of Russia. So if it will not happen, Russia will be aggressive, and it will, even if the war with Ukraine will stop one way or another, Putin will be looking for another aggression. So in the short run, sanctions will not, as Raymond correctly said, sanctions will not stop the war. No previous sanctions, no new sanctions. And even if Putin will lose more money from oil, if oil cap will be reduced, it will not be 60 by 55 or $50 per barrel, Putin will find money, will print money to finance the war. So the military victory of Ukraine as soon as possible. If the West, if the United States supply all weapons to Ukraine that were supplied in the beginning of this year, a year ago, the victory of Ukraine could happen last year, not this, or not next. So too little, too late is the biggest mistake in dealing with aggressive dictator in the war. So that's number one. Second, I would continue the thesis of Raymond, this comparison with Germany, but I would add Japan as well. The Second World War was a war with Germany and with Japan. Both countries were aggressive, and they were enemies of. No one in the United States wanted to be friends with Germany or with Japan in 1944, 1945, and Morgenthau Plan called for, let's say, dissolution of Germany, deindustrialization, making Germany poor, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, very soon, both countries became prosperous, peaceful, and friends, partners, allies of the United States. Why? Because United States incorporated, for different reasons, Japan and Germany in their military alliances and their economic alliances. So that's the only one way to move, to insist Russia in the long run, how to make it peaceful after the losing the war. So the next generation of Russian leaders should recognize that the West, the United States, first of all, is ready, despite all damages, despite all stupid, terrible policy of Putin. There is a difference between Putin and Russia. And the West, the United States, is looking to have Russia within the global world, within the global West. The United States wants to see Russia peaceful and democratic. The only one way to reach this is to incorporate Russia in its economic and military structures.
We've reached the end of a very fast hour, and I was laughing when I was listening to the last comments, because in my lectures, I talk about the idea that if in 1945 you had said that Berlin and Tokyo would be our future two closest allies, the world would have thought you were crazy. That is my point of hope, that basically people will be smart enough to make the changes. I would like to thank Sergey and Raymond for their brilliant comments. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Russian Museum of Art, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Affairs, the McAllister Russian Studies Department, and Zerkalo Russian Media. We have a number of other programs that are coming up, which will be announced, which are in development at the moment. And I wish everyone a good night, and thank you, and hope your day is good. Thank you. Spasibo большое.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Пока. Thank you. Thanks, Raymond. Thank you, Sergey. Spasibo.
Thank you. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was
Yeah, it